and welcome to Teaching Math with Picture Books. In this talk, I'm going to share why this is such a great way to engage kids in math learning and hopefully give you some practical tips for choosing and incorporating picture books into your math lessons. So I hope whether this idea is brand new to you or you've been using picture books in your math class for years, you are excited to dig in and hopefully will walk away with a fresh perspective and new ideas. So what exactly am I going to talk about today? Well, before I get started, I thought I would just give you a quick overview of where I'm going in this presentation. First, I'm going to talk about some reasons why I believe teaching math with picture books is beneficial for students of all ages. Then I'm going to walk through some goals that you might have for your students and how you can choose just the right books to help you meet those specific teaching goals. And finally, I am going to share just a handful of my favorite picture books and give you some ideas for how you might incorporate them into your lessons or use them to extend students' thinking and learning. Now, before I dive in, I just want to share a little bit about me and who I am in case you are wondering. My name is Bethany, and I'm a homeschool mom to 4 amazing kids, and I'm the owner of MathGeekMama.com, which I started in 2015. I am also the author of this little picture book, 1, 2, 3 Animals, which focuses on counting to 10 and counting backwards from 10. The goal of this story is to help students see each number from 1 to 10 in multiple ways. So on each spread, there are a half dozen or so different representations of the number for students to practice seeing and counting as they make their way to 10 and hopefully really build those subitizing skills. I also have a degree in math and a master's degree in teaching secondary education. I've spent 5 years in the classroom teaching middle and high school math, plus 8-ish years or so homeschooling my kids from kindergarten up to now 10th grade. Currently, I am teaching at a hybrid 2-day per week school for homeschool students, and I'm absolutely loving it. One of my biggest goals when I'm working with students is to help reduce math anxiety and to hopefully build a culture of confidence and curiosity. What I've seen is, especially as students get older, the wonder and the excitement and the willingness to try quickly diminishes, and students often assume that they are no good at math and they never will be. While I have a lot of tools and resources that I use to combat these negative feelings and assumptions, one easy option, especially in elementary school, is to weave in math picture books. So let's dive in now and talk about some of the reasons why I love teaching math with picture books and how this can help transform the mindsets and feelings that your students have towards math. So let's start with why. When you have so much on your plate already, so many demands on your time and your attention, why bother reading books in math class? Why spend the extra time planning in order to incorporate picture books? Well, first of all, please know that I am not going to tell you that this is something you need to do every single day, but I do hope that after hearing some of these reasons why I think it's important and beneficial, you will be excited and ready to head to your local library so you can try it out for yourself. The first reason is probably the most obvious. Good, engaging stories are going to be fun and engaging for your kids. While a student who struggles is probably going to be reluctant to participate in a typical math lesson or reluctant to complete a math worksheet, they are going to love hearing an entertaining story read aloud. This is just a really easy way to hook your kids and to draw them in. You can use a story to get them interested in a new topic of study or just to remind them that what you're currently studying doesn't have to be dry and boring. Math is exciting and fun, and when you can pull kids in and get them engaged in a fun story, you can remind them to be excited and curious about the math they're learning. The second reason is related to the first. Reading a math picture book together is a low floor task, meaning there's a low entry point, and every child has an opportunity to be engaged. This is especially helpful for kids who struggle or who are math anxious, because a lot of times they will check out before the lesson has even begun. But by reading a storybook, every single child can listen and enjoy the story. And they may not see or understand the relevant math right away, but they've at least been drawn into the discussion and they've heard the story along with everyone else. So they've had a little bit of exposure to the important math ideas, even if the connections and understanding isn't there yet, without feeling left behind or anxious. The next reason is that it provides an opportunity to build on prior knowledge, or even just assess what prior knowledge your students have as you ask questions throughout the story. A child's schema, as you probably already know, is the sum total of their knowledge. In order to learn new things, our brains have to make connections to the bits and pieces of information that we already have and already know. So reading a fun math story is a simple way to start with some ideas or vocabulary or situations that your kids might already be familiar with, and then build upon that to bridge together new mathematical ideas. So if you want to introduce something new, you have to first realize that it's not going to be entirely new. All math is interconnected and related in some way to something that the child already knows. And so if you can find a relevant math story, you can easily take something that they know and then work to build on that knowledge. Related to this idea of prior knowledge is the fact that picture books can show how math is seen and used in real life. While we could simply tell kids this, and just say, here's all the ways you see this in the real world. Or we could give them a set of word problems. That's just not the same, and it's not going to stick with them, and they're probably not going to listen very well either. They're not going to really see it or own it in the same way. But by reading an entertaining story in which math is woven throughout, even if the setting is some fictional or make-believe world, and they can see math applied in a real way, it can show kids in a more authentic way the truth that math is all around us. And this is then going to help them to understand more deeply as they form connections between math and the world around them. The next reason that reading picture books can be so helpful is that it can help kids visualize the math that they're learning. As I talk about in my online course, Making Math Visual, our brain's ability to visualize a math problem or a math concept is an essential part of our learning, understanding, and remembering that concept. That is not always an easy thing to help kids accomplish though, right? But when you're reading a math story, kids can see and engage with math images all throughout the story, and they can begin to form their own pictures and images in their mind as they hear the story. This is going to help them build up their own index of mental images so that when they are later confronted with a more abstract math problem, they have some prior knowledge and some visuals to draw from. Finally, reading picture books together can provide a fantastic springboard for rich and engaging math talks. Picture books can be a great use of your number talk time in the early grades, but even older students can have meaningful discussions around the content of a picture book. Although you can and sometimes will pose an interesting math problem or maybe a 3-act task to get your kids thinking and talking, sometimes you might want to introduce a topic or question through a story that you read together. If your kids are already invested in this story because it was funny, it was engaging, or it was related to their own life in some way, they're going to want to talk about it. They're naturally going to ask questions and they're going to want to offer up their own thoughts or opinions. So all you have to do as the teacher is to pick a good quality picture book and then just be prepared with some specific talking points or questions that you want to bring up and discuss as you read it together. So let's move on now to the really fun part, thinking about how and when to use picture books and some picture book ideas to get you started. So first of all, what do you want to accomplish? When does it make the most sense to read a picture book? Before, during, or after a lesson or a chapter? What are the goals of using a particular picture book? These are all some of the questions that you need to think through before you begin planning a lesson or weaving picture books into your current plans. Because there's no right or wrong answer. It really just depends on what your goals are, what your students need most right now, and really probably how much time you can realistically devote to reading a picture book and then sort of extending the learning based on that book. So to help you, I want to highlight some of the ways that it can sometimes make sense, be helpful to include picture books in your math lessons, and what different types of books might accomplish. Then I'm going to talk about different types or categories of books just to help you further clarify what exactly will work best for your particular situation, your goals, and your students in any given math lesson or unit. First of all, and probably most obviously, you can use picture books to teach or review targeted math content. For example, if you are starting a geometry unit, you might look for geometry-specific picture books. Or if you're talking about fractions, you might look for fraction picture books. Finding a picture book that can focus on specific math content can be a really helpful way to review in the middle of a unit or even at the end of a unit as a way to kind of sum up everything that you've learned or to encourage deeper thinking about that specific topic or even extend students' learning beyond what you have covered in your textbook lessons. Another helpful way to incorporate picture books is to use them to introduce or review key vocabulary terms. There are so many words used in math that are new or foreign to kids, and so it's really important to be intentional about teaching these words, discussing them, and then constantly reviewing these vocabulary terms. Now, sometimes there are obvious math words that will only come up in math class. So, circumference, for example. But then there are words that are used in everyday life, but they actually have a completely different or unrelated meaning when they're used in math class. And so reading a picture book that uses terms correctly and in a meaningful context can help expose students to new words, or it can open up conversations about those words, or just provide a quick check-in to see if your students are actually learning and internalizing these words. So if your goal is to introduce new vocabulary, you might choose a content-specific picture book to read as an introduction to a new unit. On the other hand, if you want to review a unit with lots of vocabulary terms, then you might read a related picture book at the end of the unit as a way to just review and summarize all of those new terms that they learned. Now, another maybe less obvious use of picture books is as a way to practice inference, estimation, and looking for patterns. So, first of all, why are these such essential skills? Well, for one, this is what mathematicians do, right? They make conjectures or big ideas about a math concept, and then they explore that topic. They look for patterns. They make inferences and predictions about what the outcome will be. Then, if they can prove and justify their prediction, they present their findings to other mathematicians. So, if we want kids to truly comprehend math and to be able to use it and apply it to solve problems and justify their thinking to their peers, then they have to be able to make inferences and good estimates based on information given, combined with their prior knowledge, to come up with good strategies and good solutions. So one way to help students build these skills is through the use of picture books, and I will share some fun examples in just a little bit. Now, another good use of picture books is to help students make connections. Now, why is it so important that we form meaningful connections? Well, for one, this is just simply how we are wired as human beings. This is how we make sense of the world, by connecting the things that we see or read or experience to things we already know or have previously experienced. We do this when we meet someone new for the first time. So we meet someone new and we look for, do we have mutual acquaintances, or have we had mutual experiences or common likes and dislikes, and that helps us get to know them better and remember them. And the same is true in math. Making these types of connections is going to help our students to have a deeper understanding of the math that they're learning and to retain it better. So as we think about forming connections with picture books, there are just a few different types of connections that you want to look for and consider. First, we have math to math connections. That's going to be tying one maybe known and well understood math concept to another concept that's related but maybe brand new for students. Then we have math to world, or the real world, things around us connections. And then for students, math to self connections. How is the math that they're learning actually related to them personally, and what can they do with it? Okay, one last but important use of picture books is they can help students build those problem-solving and logical reasoning skills. So this means you might look for books that will help kids synthesize or put together bits and pieces of information to better understand the big picture. These are typically going to be books that don't necessarily explicitly teach math concepts, but they do show big math ideas and how they're used in real life situations, or maybe they show a character using and applying math concepts to solve a bigger problem. So you'll want to look for stories that can help kids visualize a big mathematical idea without it actually explaining it word for word to them. They'll have to put the information together themselves and start using their own problem solving and reasoning skills to make sense of the story and the big math idea. Now, when you're reading a story like this, you will want to be intentional as you read or after you read to ask questions that are going to lead kids towards that big math idea. Don't try to explain it to them, but just ask questions that will get them thinking about it and allow them time to make sense of it on their own in their own way. So as one child notices something, ask it, did anyone see or think about that differently? And then just get a dialogue going and allow kids to bounce ideas off of each other, or to look for more than one strategy, and hopefully deepen their overall understanding. Now, before I get into some specific examples and how you might use them for different math lessons, I just want to give an overview of the different types of storybooks that are out there, just to further help you make informed decisions as you go about looking for just the right book for your particular lesson. And I want to preface this by saying I did not come up with this system of categorization, but I found it incredibly helpful as I was reading and comparing different picture books. So I wanted to share it with you. Now, I originally read this in an article from Scholastic, but it seems the article is no longer available on their website. But anyway, because there are copious amounts of picture books out there, as I said earlier, the reality is you're never going to have time to read them all. You can't realistically read and incorporate a new math story every single day. And even if you did, you still wouldn't be able to read them all. So instead, I'm just going to share some of my thoughts and the different categories of picture books, so you can use this as a guide as you start to plan out why and when and how you're going to include picture books in your own math lessons. For the first category of books, I'm going to refer to them as Tier 1 books. Now, Tier 1, these are books that were written specifically to teach a math concept. So in these, there is no plot, there's no story, it's just, hopefully, a fun and engaging book with lots of vocabulary, lots of meaningful illustrations. And these are the math picture books that probably you will find in the nonfiction section of your library, because they have that explicit goal of teaching math. Now, in my personal opinion, not all Tier 1 books are good or engaging, okay? Just because it was written for kids doesn't mean that the kids are going to actually enjoy it. So while you can certainly, there are times when you can certainly use Tier 1 books, it can be harder to find a good one. But when can you plan on using a Tier 1 book? Well, first, because they are specifically written to teach a math concept, they are usually really rich in math vocabulary. So this could make it an easy way to introduce or discuss math-specific terms. This is also a helpful way to just clarify or maybe clear up misconceptions about a particular math topic or math vocab term. Another benefit of Tier 1 books is that they can help you to look at math from a lot of different angles. So because these books usually try to cover the topic in a really comprehensive way, you can use them to think about and discuss that topic in a lot of different ways. So I would just also note here that I personally wouldn't recommend starting a brand new unit with a Tier 1 book. So remember, when we're starting a new chapter or a new unit, we want to start with one of those low floor, low entry point tasks so that all kids can be involved and engaged and excited. And we want to begin with more open discussions that really allow for exploration and discovery. So if you begin with a Tier 1 book, it's going to immediately make the lesson very math heavy and potentially overwhelming for some kids. And it's also going to be more teacher-centered than student-centered. So instead, you might use a Tier 1 book at the end of the unit just as a way to review, to talk about and summarize all the things now that students have learned this and they've been exposed to the concepts and they have their own ideas and understandings. You can bring in one of these books to just kind of review and summarize, or again to clear up any misconceptions maybe that you have seen throughout the unit. Okay, so what are some examples of Tier 1 books? Again, not all are going to be good or interesting or helpful, but there are some good ones out there. So this first one, The Best of Times from Greg Tang. As you probably know, Greg Tang is the author of a lot of math picture books, and he is just a great go-to resource when you're looking for something fun and engaging. This book, in particular, uses silly rhymes to learn and explain the multiplication facts. So again, this would make a really fun review after kids have explored the meaning of multiplication and have been practicing and learning all of those facts. This next example is Mission Addition from Laureen Leedy. Laureen Leedy is another author who has written a really large collection of math picture books, and in general, I probably haven't read every single one, but generally they tend to be Tier 1 books. And this one in particular is a great example of looking at multiple representations of a concept like addition, seeing lots of representations, lots of great visuals, and also an opportunity to review important vocabulary words. Okay, so let's move on now to Tier 2. These books are similar to Tier 1 in that there has been an intentional attempt to teach or explain math in some way. The difference here is that these books do tell an actual story, meaning there are characters and there's a plot of some sort. So the story could stand alone as an engaging story, even if the math elements weren't there or you're not paying attention or trying to learn math from it. You can just enjoy the story. In these stories, the author has deliberately used a real-life situation to make connections to mathematics. I would say that probably most math picture books fall into this category. These make really fun and engaging read-alouds, and they can then lead to some really rich math discussions. So I'm going to talk more in depth in just a little bit about how you can include these in your lessons, but here are just a few examples of what you might use Tier 2 books for. First, to help kids make connections between the math they're learning and the world around them, or math to self connections, to build on their prior knowledge, or to pose an interesting problem to solve related to the math that you're studying. So maybe you pull a problem directly from the story and see how your kids tackle it, or how many different ways they can find to solve it. Or maybe you just create a problem based on the story, related to the story, or extending the story in some way, and have your kids tackle that problem. So a few examples of Tier 2 books, although there are so many, I'll just share a few here, and I'll get into a little more depth about how you can use them in a few minutes. First is the set of circumference books by Cindy Neuschwander. These books are written intentionally to relate to specific math concepts, but the stories are so fun and engaging for kids that it's a great way to talk about specific math topics and ideas, and it includes lots of really fun math puns. Matthew McElligott is another author to look out for. He has a lot of really funny math picture books, which often weave in important character lessons that you could discuss as well. Here's one of my favorites, Bean 13, which I'm going to talk about a little more in a minute, but it is just an adorable way to explore division, the concept of remainder, and so much more. Finally, another favorite of mine is the story The Wishing Club. This book has such beautiful illustrations, and it is a fun way to explore fractions. All right, lastly, we have Tier 3 picture books. Now, Tier 3 books may or may not have a direct mention or any explicit connection to math at all. These are just books that were written primarily to tell an engaging story, and they might just also happen to have some connections to math. In my opinion, these make the ideal introduction to a particular unit or a new chapter because they can open up the conversation. They are much less intimidating for students, and they can provide meaningful, open-ended exploration around questions that students might have after you read it. These also, like Tier 2 books, can be used to pose interesting mathematical problems. Ideally, these might be things that your students are wondering about during or after reading the story anyway, and then they can just have some time to explore that problem together or independently after reading the story. So what are some examples of Tier 3 books? Well, for this, really any book can be used to connect to math in some way would be a Tier 3 book, especially if you are just being really thoughtful and intentional about looking for some interesting math question or connection that you can make from a story to math. Even if it's not like explicitly stated in the story, it's not written to teach about fractions, but there's something there that you can tie to math. That could be any picture book. But here are a couple of examples that I will just share with you. The first is the book Caps for Sale. Now, this story, again, it was not written as a way to teach math, but it could be used to explore a variety of math concepts, from counting to addition and subtraction, because of the peddler's large collection of caps and the different types of caps that he has. One last example, the cute folktale Two of Everything. In this story, the couple discovers a magical pot which doubles everything that they put into it. So again, this story is not written specifically about math or multiplication, but it could be a great way to introduce doubles in addition, or to introduce multiplication and specifically multiplying by 2. So now that you've got some ideas for when, why, and how you might include more picture books, I'm just going to share some examples and go a little more in depth to talk about how you might use these specific books in your classroom depending on what grade and ages you're teaching. So for the first example, I want to take a closer look at The Wishing Club by Donna Jo Napoli. As you can see from the cover, this is a story about fractions, so it's a great non-threatening way to introduce fractions, to talk about unit fractions, because this story weaves in the fractions 1/2, 1/4, and 1/8. But there's so much more math that you could explore here. For example, you might ask students to create equivalent fractions for each fraction in the story. If you teach older kids, you might discuss fractions and their relationship to division, or even dividing fractions by whole numbers. You can combine the characters' wishes to practice adding fractions. Now, as I mentioned earlier, picture books can offer a great opportunity to practice those inference skills and looking for patterns. So this is a great example of that, because your students can look for patterns in the wishes and the results, and they can use that to estimate the next result. They can then create their own wishes to put their understanding of the pattern into practice. So when and how you incorporate this book would depend on what you're teaching and the age of your students, but I think it would be a great read aloud at the beginning of a unit, and then you could continue to circle back to this story throughout your study of fractions. Some other ideas for extending the story: have your students make their own wishes, meaning they divide a certain number of candies or toys, and draw pictures of that to show their wish, or let them calculate how their wish club would split the items equally among members. You could also use manipulatives like fraction bars or other bar drawings, and have your students draw pictures to visualize each of the wishes in the story. Or if you have a little more time and your students are just really enjoying the connections to this story, you could even allow them to write their own short story involving wishes and have them include a math problem involving fractions. Another really fun story that I mentioned earlier is Bean 13 by Matthew McElligott. This can be used to discuss division, and especially division with remainders, but it's so much more than that. You could use this in a unit about factors and multiples, to talk about prime numbers, or just to discuss divisibility rules in general. I also think this would be really fun to act out with actual beans, and this would allow students to actually see and split apart themselves the 13 beans. They could then use other quantities of beans to look for patterns or to look for other examples of prime numbers. Some other ideas for incorporating this into your lessons. You could have your students use beans to divide larger numbers. They could use beans to divide other numbers as a way to find all the factors. You could have students create a list of all the prime numbers that they can find using their beans or drawing pictures. It might get a little unwieldy to continue using beans as the numbers get larger, so they might transition to just drawing pictures or diagrams of some sort, but trying to see who can find the most prime numbers might be fun. And lastly, you could have a discussion about the fairness of division and ask your students, what are some ways, what could we do with that last bean? What are some fair ways to divide the last bean? And then really extend this to division with fraction answers. Now, as another example, we have the circumference series again. I'm not going to go into the details of every single story in the series because there are 10 books altogether, but these are great options, especially for geometry topics. Most of the stories in the series focus on some particular geometry concept, but there's also one that focuses on place value and is great for younger kids. And there's also the one that you see here that's about fractions. Because they focus on specific math content, you can really easily weave these into related math units. So when you do so is up to you and what you want your students to do with it. These could be used as an introduction right at the start of a chapter or unit, or it could be used as a way to review and reinforce that topic somewhere in the middle of the unit. Maybe you just want to take a break from your normal kind of math routine and spend a day reading a related book and just kind of doing some fun activities to go along with it. This could be a really good way to break the unit up with something fun and just a change of pace. One idea that you might try is to combine the story with some kind of hands-on manipulative or some visual models so that students can really internalize the concepts. So what that looks like is going to depend on which book you're using. But if you need some help or ideas, I do have a variety of extension lessons for these available on my website, and that can make it even easier for you to incorporate these stories into your lessons. One more series that I want to share that might be less familiar to you is the Warlord series of books by Virginia Pilgard. Again, I'm not going to discuss every book here in depth because there are, I believe, 8 in this series, but they cover things from place value to geometry to rate and more. What I love about this series is it can provide a unique opportunity to combine math with some of the history and culture of China, or you could even weave in some geography of China. And so this might be a fun mini unit if you do any world history or geography whenever you're talking about China, or maybe the Chinese New Year with your students. You might pick up 1 or 2 of these books to read as well. I also appreciate that a lot of times at the back of these books, there's going to be some more information or even a related project that you could try with your students. These will sometimes relate to the math in the story, but also some science topics. So you can then have a whole unit study around these books where you're learning geography and history and math and science, all around a really fun story that your kids are going to enjoy. And again, I actually have some resources available on my website to go along with some of these books as well, if you would like to find some and try it out with your student. Another example from Greg Tang that you might already be familiar with is The Grapes of Math. I just love this fun and engaging book because it can be used to encourage creative thinking and problem solving, but it is also another example that you can use to help kids look for patterns and make predictions. So, if you teach younger kiddos, this can be a great way to work on counting and to look for creative ways to group objects to make counting easier and faster. But if you teach older kids, you can take it even further. For example, you might relate the grouping and the counting to addition strategies, such as making 10 or doubling, and how those addition strategies relate to the picture. If your students are ready, you can relate it to multiplication and look for equal groups, or look at arrays and how those model multiplication. And if your students are in a 5th or 6th grade, you can really stretch their thinking by encouraging them to write a numerical expression to represent the picture, and then try to find equivalent expressions for that, and then share and justify with the group or with the class why those expressions are equivalent. This is truly a book that can be used with all ages, and if your students enjoy this one, I also have some extension pages to go along with this story on my website as well. Okay, I could go on all day long with dozens of additional examples, but I'm going to wrap it up here with some books by Steve Jenkins to touch on measurement. In the book's Actual Size and Biggest, Strongest, Fastest, Jenkins shares interesting animal facts and measurements with unique and really beautiful illustrations. Now, when it comes to teaching and exploring small and large numbers or measurement, my preference personally is always to look to the natural world. There are so many unique creatures that we could learn about And these books by Steve Jenkins just provide the perfect springboard for all kinds of discussions or math activities depending on the ages that you teach. This is also a great example of some books that can help kids make connections between math and the real world. So here are just a handful of ideas for how you might use these books in your classroom, depending on what grade you teach. And I'm sure you could come up with even more ideas specific to your grade and your standards, but here are some just to get you thinking. First of all, before you even open or read these books with your students, start with estimation. So choose some of the animals or some of the facts from the story and ask your students to estimate the sizes or their speed or whatever it is that's shared in the story. And they can maybe even give a high and a low guess before you read the book. This might include questions like, how big do you think a gorilla's hand is? And give them a chance to come up with some estimates. Either you could just discuss some estimates together as a group, or they could even come up with their own individually before you read it together as a class. You could then, after you read, you could have students put the sizes of different animals in order from least to greatest. If you have younger ones, you could have your students graph the different sizes, the different numbers on a number line in order to compare them. Or you could use the info in these books to practice data collection. You could create a class chart of some attribute that you see in the books, like height, speed, or weight. Have students collect any data they can find in the stories, and then you could create a graph together of the different animals to order and compare them, and then sort of analyze that data and see what you can learn about the different animals. You could also create estimation or measurement tasks just based on the facts in the book, such as measure the width of your hand and then compare it to the hand of a gorilla, and let your students actually practice measuring and then maybe drawing on a piece of paper their hand and then drawing the width of a gorilla and seeing that comparison. Or you might ask them to estimate how many students it would take if they're standing on each other's shoulders to equal the height of a giraffe. If you're able, another fun way to really visualize these measurements and compare them in a more tangible way is to go outside with some sidewalk chalk. If you have a very long sidewalk or a clear road, where there's not cars coming through, you could let students take some of the measurements of some of the larger animals and actually just draw that measurement out on the sidewalk and then see just how big some of these animals are or how small, and compare maybe the smallest to the largest or something like that. Finally, if you teach middle school, you could even take some of these measurements and create ratios and proportions and have your students create scale drawings of the different animals. For example, they might create a scale drawing to compare the height of a human to a gorilla to a giraffe or something like that. All right, before I wrap this up, I just want to end with a few final thoughts and hopefully some words of encouragement. First of all, I just want you to remember that picture books are meant to be enjoyed first and foremost as a story. So I would encourage you to always begin by reading the story together and just allowing your kids to really be drawn in and engaged with the characters. Just read the story. Don't stop and discuss. Don't ask, those big math questions. Just enjoy the story. Then you can go back through another day or later in the week and have a more focused and intentional math discussion to go along with the book. Next, this probably goes without saying, but I would encourage you to choose books that you enjoy reading, as well as books that your kids are going to enjoy hearing. If you are bored or disinterested and not enjoying the story, your kids are going to notice and they're not going to be interested either. Next, I know I have talked about a lot of different skills that we can teach and practice as we read picture books together with our students, like vocabulary or making predictions or problem solving and so on. But I don't want you to think of these as individual objectives that are distinct and separate from one another, because you can likely touch on or strengthen a lot of these skills with just one book, all within the same book. So in any given unit, you don't necessarily need to find one book to learn vocabulary, and then another book to make connections, and then another book to problem solve. With the right book, you can cover a lot of these skills all at once. Finally, if you are not used to incorporating picture books into your math lessons, my encouragement is just to start small. Maybe that means just one picture book based lesson in your next unit. Then you can slowly build up from there as you come up with new ideas or you discover new books. You don't have to go from never using picture books at all to writing lessons for 5 different books per chapter. You don't have to do that. So that is all I have for you today, but I just want to thank you again so much for joining me for this talk here at the Build Math Minds Summit. I hope you enjoyed this look at engaging picture books, and I sincerely hope that you found some ideas you can use. And I will just remind you, if you would like some done-for-you resources, be sure to grab my free Picture Book Math Starter Kit, which includes 8 book lists for various math topics, along with some printable lessons and activities to go along with some of the stories that I shared here. So I hope you will grab that and enjoy it with your students. Thanks again.